is Module 4. Optimistic American Involvement in an Insecure World, which we can also call Involvement Without Commitment. So let's start by looking at the whole world as a whole and various regions of the world outside of the United States. This is a time when the world is living in the aftermath of World War I, a time of disillusionment, a time of disruption, a time of severe social tension, a time of rapid political change. We talk about fascism and communism as the two extreme ideologies that felt that liberal democracy was basically finished and no good. Briefly, fascism, of course, was the ideology of Benito Mussolini that was instituted in Italy. Italy really started the first fascist government in Europe in 1921. The fascists never won more than 15% of any election in Italy, but they didn't care because they felt that elections were essentially corrupt and that they could win power through strong armed tactics, through violence, intimidation, street fights, and they basically took over the government in Rome by leading a march and intimidating the king, who named Mussolini as the prime minister because he felt, or he claimed at least, that Mussolini had the assent of the Italian people. So read your book about fascism and Mussolini. Now, at this point, fascism in Germany had not yet taken root. We'll see that in the next module. The other major ism, or the other major ideology that denied democratic government was communism, which was an extreme left-wing ideology. Fascism sought to turn the clock way back. Communism, on the other hand, sought to move rapidly very forward into a very bright, supposedly bright future and completely change society. So whereas fascism was claimed to be extremely traditional and conservative and going back to an alleged glorious past, communism claimed to wipe out the present and leap forward into a glorious future, which supposedly would mean the abolition of all social classes, the withering away of the state, and even eventually the withering away of international relations and a global regime of communism where the people ruled and where the government could satisfy everyone's needs. But in order to achieve this, of course, they had to make some very radical changes through force and through the suppression of multi-party democracy. So look about that in your book. We also looked at various aspects of the United States in the 1920s. Now, the United States really emerged unquestionably as the world's greatest economic power. Huge increase in America's productivity. America really outstripped Britain in terms of the growth of its economy and its importance economically, and New York really replaced London as the financial capital of the world. There was also a great deal of American soft power in the sense of American cultural influence abroad. Americans went abroad as missionaries, as tourists, and briefly there was an American community in Paris that was very important, which not only was a question of the Americans overseas affecting the French, but the French influencing the American expatriates in Paris, who then came home and wrote and influenced American literature. We briefly looked at the black Americans in the reading in Paris and their importance in terms of an international African-American, African black cultural movement called Pan-Africanism, which came to have, as we shall see later, a very important impact on domestic life and politics in the United States. even though the United States failed to join the League of Nations. States failed to join the League of Nations. The spirit of the League of Nations continued into the 1920s in this country, especially in Congress, in the Peace Progressives and Senator William Borah of Idaho, and a number of domestic peace advocacy organizations such as the International League for Peace and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which put a lot of pressure on the government, but also in Europe, in Western Europe, in England and France, and in Germany, there was a strong sentiment among many people for a peaceful, democratic, liberal international world. Now, why did that fail? The reasons are complicated, and they have a great deal to do with the fact that a lot of the forces which had created World War I were still there. And then added to that was economic insecurity. The international economy in the 1920s was a house of cards, and it collapsed with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, 1930, 1931, so that by the end of this period, the collapse of economic security, what little economic security there was, brought on an intensification of fascism and communism in Europe. And as the fascists and communists fought it out in the streets of France, and especially in Germany, right-wing extremism grew, and in other parts of Europe as well. And of course it was in Germany that right-wing extremism, fascism, German Nazism, German fascism is really Nazism, triumphed. Now I also want you to read the section and the four attempts internationally to deal with problems of peace, security, and disarmament. National conferences in the 1920s. There was the Killow-Briand Pact, the Washington Naval Conference, the Locarno Agreement, and the were efforts in which the United States either actively participated or certainly played an important contributory role. None of these movements were under the auspices of the League of Nations, which in itself was a problem because it meant that all of the really significant movements for international peace and security were outside of the League. The United States had no foreign policy in Africa at this time because all of the African countries, with only two exceptions, were under the influence of some colonial power. So we'll not really deal with Africa at all at this time, primarily Latin America and Asia. In Latin America, the United States continued its sort of paternalistic, overbearing attitude of Yankee imperialism and telling Latin American countries what to do and how to run their affairs. The Latin Americans, of course, resented what they felt was North American Yankee arrogance. And the same was true in the Far East, where in China there was a bitter and violent, bloody civil war going on between Chiang Kai-shek and the leaders of the communist movement. Chiang Kai-shek was a nationalist, but he really didn't promote representative democracy or help the poor people of China. And the Chinese communists, claimed that they were promoting Marxism and were, but they were fighting it out. And meanwhile, as the Chinese fought each other, Japan encroached into northern China, especially into Manchuria, and began to take over large parts of northern China. Americans tried to bring peace in China through an open door policy, through trade and investment, and through advocacy of liberal representative democracy and liberal internationalism. But a lot of that fell hollow because the Chinese distrusted the Americans, whom they felt had mission, were out to make a fast buck, but also because they saw Americans as racists and people with color prejudice. And this, of course, was intensified by America's immigration laws, which barred Asian people, especially specifically barred Japanese people, by the prevalence of the Ku Klux Klan in America. And so they tended, as did the Latin Americans, to regard Americans as hypocrites. And so, throughout this period of time in the 1920s, it was a time when the efforts towards democracy and liberal internationalism seemed temporarily to succeed, but really didn't. And all it took was this devastating global economy to bring the whole thing down. So that, as we shall see in the next module, this rather fragile international system fell apart in the 1930s, and each country pursued its own selfish individual aims, and in the case of Germany and Japan and Italy, that was violence, fascism, and world conquest.